All right, so in this video, we're going to go ahead and start the process of texturing this model. Now, I'm not going to do it from start to finish, otherwise we'd all get really bored doing that. But I just want to give you an example of how I set it up and my thinking behind it when I do create textures for one of my models. And so one of the things you want to do is make sure you grab your model, go into edit mode, select it, and then you're going to click up here, UV, export UV layout. I'm just going to do this to the desktop real quick, and I'll just call this UV layout, and it saves it as a PNG file. Okay, so make sure it's PNG, and fill opacity you can set to whatever you want, but I change it to 1. I export the UV layout. What ends up happening now is I can actually open this up, and you'll see that it's here like so. What I really like to do is once I get into Photoshop, I will hold left control and click on the little image for the layer. It selects everything in that image. Click plus sign, create a new layer, and I will use either black or white and fill all of it in. Okay, and once I do that, I'll take the bottom layer, move it to the top. I will lock it at, wait, I'll change the opacity first, something like so, and then I will lock it in place. This bottom layer, I'm not going to really touch anymore, so I'm going to lock it in place. I'm going to create another layer. And usually weapons tend to be gray. Sometimes they're tan or green or whatever. Use a background color. Oop. Make sure you turn off the selection, so Control D. And I'm going to create that layer, select the fill bucket tool. Now I'm going to create a filled layer. And so like use a color that makes sense for the weapon you're creating, whether it's going to be a dark gray or a dark green or a darker tan color, kind of brown, and then do what you need to do there. Okay, and so that's pretty much the process of getting set up to create. And I lock this one as well. I won't touch that again. And that's the process of getting my Photoshop file set up for the most part. The reason I create the white one there is so I can grab with a magic wand tool here. Okay, and I can select the whole section at any given time if I need to. Or if I need to select multiple sections, you just hold shift and you can kind of click around and select what you need. Now, because I created the padding in the UV layout to be only like 2 pixels, I found that Photoshop doesn't have a huge problem with getting with having seams. You know, it seems to select a little bit outside of the selection, like compared to older versions of Photoshop. So I don't have a problem with seams too much. You can see here it just jumps out by like a pixel almost. And so I don't worry about doing what I would have to normally do, which is go to select, modify, and expand. And you can expand your selections. So if you want to make them a little bit more padding on the side there. That's what I used to have to do all the time. I didn't seem to have to do it with this project. So, but if you do run into that issue where you're having seams show up in your texture work, or like the little gray areas are showing up in your texture work, you might want to consider doing the select expand method. Now, really what this comes down to is when I get into all of it, what I like to do is just use images for the most part for all my texture work. And I'll select the pieces that I need, and I'll start just, it's a lot of copying and pasting and using the different marquees and selection methods. But, you know, I'll take them in and I'll hold shift if I turn the unlock off, or if you have the unlock on, you can hold shift to do that. But if it's the width and height is locked together, you don't have to hold nothing. But what I'll do is I'll start laying the model in, or the texture in anyways, where it needs to go. And then you kind of have to move it around a little bit, kind of fudge it into place. And you're going to do this a lot. Okay, trust me. Sometimes you got to stretch it a little bit, perhaps. That's not unheard of. Okay, so you'll do things like that. White borders and stuff, I don't really care for having borders, but check this out. This is why I like that selection bottom layer there, where I could select it real quick. because now I can go back to my texture here, press Control Shift I. So let's say I placed it perfectly where I wanted it. I can press, I can select the main body there, press Control Shift I, which inverts the selection. Now I can press the delete key, and it will get rid of it. Okay, so you can see how quick I can kind of line things up like that. And you know, I may do something like that on one side, and I may finish kind of graying in the corners here. So a lot of times, if you have a pen tablet or a pencil tablet, whatever you want to call it, where you get pressure sensitivity, the pressure sensitivity is up here. So if you're on a 2-in-1 laptop, usually you have a pen that can go with it that's pressure sensitive. Sometimes you'll get, you know, you'll buy like a Wacom Intuos or something like that. And so you can come in here and just start coloring with that pen and adding additional textures and details, which is pretty useful. And you can see you can come in here and just add color if you want. Now it's going to blow out some of those textures, so I always highly recommend using a clone stamp tool. Kind of the same process here. You can press Alt, select an area where you want to clone those textures. And you can just go around and click. Now I have the flow set lower, but for like an initial lay-in, sometimes 100% is good. But to blend things together a little bit finer, you can turn that flow down, and you see that I can kind of work things together. Now you can hold and drag around as long as you got space to do it wherever you're sampling from. Just keep this in mind. There's this little button here at the top that says use same offset for each stroke. So when you do this number, every time you move your mouse, your sample area is going to change. So I turn that off usually, just to make sure I'm using the areas that I want to sample from. And you can see how fast this can kind of go. And you can also do this in Blender. And I'll show you that here towards the end of this tutorial. But you can certainly start doing this number. So maybe you want it darker on this edge, or you want this dark gray color on the edge. All right. And then you might duplicate it over. Press Control T to transform the selection. I'm going to flip it vertically and then just move it down and line it up with the bottom half as well. And just try to get it about right, like so. No big deal. And then you'll come in and you'll start using the clone stamp tool and all the other tools, and you'll just, you know, do little patches here or there and have fun with it. Always make new selections whenever you're creating something. So if you're doing the magazine, get a new selection. Use multiple images, okay? Multiple images of a AUG or whatever rifle you're creating. And you can bring those layers in. So for example, maybe I need this piece here because I just mirrored from the left to the right. Now, weapons are different on each side of it. So I might mirror to start with, but then I might need pieces to put onto this side over here. So this might be placed here. I'm going to transform it. Don't forget you have all kinds of different warp options here. You can right click, click warp. You have, you know, arcs and this and that and this and that. That's a lot of useful tools. There's also skew and perspective. Use Photoshop to its fullest potential, and you should have a good time with this. You can use masking. So if you don't know about what a mask is, you click this little button while you have the layer selected. It creates a mask. Black and white image, basically, where white is visible and black is transparent. If you want to work in a less destructive manner, I recommend using a mask. But if you, for whatever reason, don't have any problem with, okay, so let's use the brush now here. But if you want to work in a destructive manner, you can just use the eraser. I'll use both. It depends on what I'm doing and how confident I am that I'm going to get the right kind of selection out of it. So the eraser as well. You can just come in here. You can't do it on the mask, but you can do it on the actual pixels. So you can see if I messed up here, it would be destructive and I wouldn't be able to undo it, whereas a mask I could. So, I mean, I could undo it by pressing Control Z, but if I've ran out of Control Z memory, I can't do it no more. But with a mask, you can always switch back to white and start on that mask layer, start coloring wherever it's going to let me. Jeez. Oh, I'm using the eraser. Sorry. There we go. So with a mask, you see I can erase. Maybe I make a big mistake and I'm like, oh no. Well, I can use white now. I'm pressing X to swap between black and white right now. You just set it. Just click the little black and white icon, that really tiny one. You can do that. So you can see I can come back in and really get it going and looking right. Other things like this, sometimes they can be a little bit problematic. You can see here, this rail is modeled, so I wouldn't need it in the texture. You can try and edit, fill, content aware fill. Oops, let's try it on the right layer. Edit, fill, content aware fill. And sometimes it'll get it right, sometimes it doesn't. A lot of times what I find myself doing is referencing other photos for certain things. So like right here, I might want that. I'll just paste it in and then resize it and scale it. And, you know, don't forget to match your colors and everything else, of course, but come in, get it mostly correct, and not worry about it too much after that. So I might do that number there. It's mostly positioned right. And then I got to match the colors, so I'll do adjustment, hue, saturation. You can see it's mostly blue if I saturate it, and that's not a big deal, but the other one's a little bit of an off blue, so I can match the colors, change my brightnesses around a little bit, perhaps make them a tiny bit darker. Okay, use the eraser or mask, whatever you choose, and go in here and do that. Erase softly around the sides. You can also do this with a selection. So you can use for example, the selector here, the marquee selector. If you feather your selections before you select them, it'll make them soft. So example, this area I like, but I want to make it soft. So I'm going to select it with a feather of 5. And you'll see when I select it, it does like so. Now if I copy it and paste it, I can move it out. You can see we get these really nice soft kind of patches like that. It's really useful. Okay, I'm going to turn that top piece off just for a second. I want to explain something here. I'm going to collapse the entire stack. Normally, as I complete objects and I like the way they look, I'll just collapse it down just so I have less layers to work with. And you can certainly leave your layers open. You don't have to do that. But I'm going to create another layer. I use my soft brushes a lot. So maybe I want it to be a little bit brighter on the top of this thing. I might just add white, hold down shift and click and drag. It creates straight lines vertically or horizontally, and that's going to allow you to do that number. You might do something like an overlay and make the opacity a little bit lower. So use your different blending modes for sure. You know, something like that might work. Or I might do the same thing with black, but usually I keep a light layer and a dark layer on separate layers so I can control them kind of independently. Okay. Same deal, you can do an overlay or a multiply or whatever. And then just, you know, bump it in. So you can create shading. Shading's real important in Ghost Recon because your textures, your models doesn't have a lot of detail to it, so your textures are going to be what conveys the geometry of the model, or what the model should actually look like anyways. And so you can do all these kind of fun things. It's pretty awesome. You will run into a little bit of a problem. For example, on the magazine, it has a pattern that kind of bends around and wraps around the side. And if you notice on the UV layout, here is the magazine sides, okay, and the actual front and backs of the magazines are over here. Laying your map out manually is beneficial. Sometimes you'll avoid things having it lay out crooked like that. But you know, don't fret too much. It's if you break down your model as simple as possible for the most part, you'll be able to find everything rather easily. But it's a lot of trial and error. Just keep that in mind. So you can start creating this texture like I've been demonstrating, and then just save it as you go along. I use a Photoshop file for this, and I'll just call it texture or whatever. You can name it whatever you want pretty much. Just texture. I'll save it. And so when I go to my model here in Blender, all I do instead of using, well, we'll still be in grid, but I'll just click open. And I'll go to desktop and open up that texture. And you'll notice that it actually did open it, but over here in the materials side, nothing changed. So I'm going to click here, and I'm just going to go down to texture.psd and swap that image file as well. Because the grid isn't gone, but we're just swapped over to texture, that's all. And so now you can see how this is starting to lay out, and it's going to start looking better and better as you keep working on it. It's really not that complicated, and it's going to take some time, though. You know, this is the lengthiest part of creating a weapon, in my opinion, if you really want to make it look right and look good. I'm going to jump over. Oh, no, before we jump over, if you take this model and you press X and just create a new material here, and for the base color, we're going to do image texture. We're going to click new, 1024 by 1024. I'm going to show you this real quick. Okay, so new, we're going to make it white. Okay, 1024 by 1024. Oh, you know what? We could have kept it as black as well. Let's just leave it as black first. And then we'll go to this is where it gets interesting. Instead of using Eevee, we're going to swap over to cycles. Okay, under this little TV kind of looking icon here. I'm going to switch to render engine to cycles. You'll see there's a bake option. Under bake, there's all kinds of stuff. You don't really need any of it. But all you need is ambient, direct, indirect, and ambient occlusion. Okay. And then you can switch it down to ambient occlusion. And you can click bake at this point with the object selected. All right, so once it's baked, you'll see here, if I shade it flat, it has a little bit of shadow to it now in certain places. Okay. And that little bit of shadow, there's no lighting from the scene. This is the baked lighting. Okay, you can take this, if you go back over to texture paint, you'll see that's what was baked out. You can take this and use it as a little bit of extra shading for your model when you're texturing it. So just save it out, image, save as a PNG file, desktop. This is called an ambient occlusion map. It's really rough on these because it's such low poly, but it does help to some degree. So you can take that ambient occlusion map now. We're going to copy it and paste it in here. You can set it to multiply. Now I'm going to toggle it on and off, and you can kind of see where it's adding a little extra shading and whatnot. It's useful. All right. So if I save that again, Control S, just save it. I might want to grab my model and switch the material back to the original one. Get this back to texture.psd. So now it will have a little bit of burnt or baked shading into it. Baked lighting, if you will. And yeah, so that's just a little added touch. Moving on from that, let me talk about a couple things real quick. And when you're working with a Photoshop file and you're in texture paint mode or in Blender, you can use texture paint, but whatever you do, don't reload the texture. That's what's going to end up happening here. So I'm going to go to the layout view. Let me give you an example. Like this piece we know is going to be mostly polymer on the bottom. And so if we were to switch from this mode to texture paint mode, now we're in texture paint, we can grab the clone stamp tool. We want to make sure it's set up right so we can use these properties here. And it should be okay. If you hold Control and left click, you'll sample an area. Change your strength, your radius, your fall off, all kinds of other fun stuff. And you'll see I can actually clone stamp. Okay. Now I recommend doing this last, after you've laid out as much texture as you can in Photoshop, and use this to heal up seams, okay? I think that's the most benefit you're going to get from it, because what's going on right now is in This file here, you can see it's filling in data, but in your Photoshop file, nothing's changing. And so if you were to reload your image, it's still the same image. It didn't save it. So basically what's going on is when you start doing this inside of Photoshop or inside of Blender, you start clone stamping things. Super cool, super quick. Just try to make sure you don't cover up your screws or anything like that. You have to resave this texture file. So what you would do is simply go back to the UV editing screen here. You click Image, Save As, save it as a whatever you want, but PNG file is what I prefer. RGB, 8-bit, 16-bit, etc., etc. Change your settings there, and now you can call this one finished up, patched, or whatever you want to call it. Save it something. Save it as something you remembered. But that's kind of like my final touches there. And I'll use the heal and brush tool or the clone stamp tool. I call it heal and brush or clone stamp. They kind of behave the same, but I'll use that to mend up my seams and corners. I think it's extremely useful. But I'll also use texture paint to do little details. So I might make my brush real small, and I might use just black and white for the most part. All right. I'm in texture paint, right? All right. Oh, I got clone stamp tools. Sorry. Kind of a brain fart there, huh? All right. You can see I can color in white now. I'll turn that strength down real low. Do that number. Turn the size. You can use F and Control F for those as well. Or F and Shift F. So F changes your size. Shift F is the pressure. Okay. And I'll use my pen for this. So I'll use a tablet for it. And I can just quickly go through this model and add rough spots on the edges and do all that kind of fun stuff. I can add some shading. You're going to get kind of a hand brushed look of those, so be a little bit wary of that, all right? It can make it look a little wacky. In Photoshop, however, Photoshop, you can make straight lines by clicking somewhere and holding Shift and clicking again. So keep that in mind. If you ever need to do angled straight lines, you certainly can do that. So you click, hold Shift, and click again and create lines like that. So a lot of little tricks, but that's pretty much what it comes down to. And then you can also do, adjust things, brightness, contrast, hue, saturation. Give you an example here why hue and saturation and color is so important. If I take hue, saturation, bump it up, you'll see that this, what looks mostly to be gray, has a lot of orange in it, and it has a lot of blue in it as well. You want to try to mimic that throughout your whole texture. There's kind of fun ways to do this and kind of not fun ways to do this. I'm going to give you one quick example. Copy, paste. So if I was making this here and I was trying to match the color, or I wanted it to be rougher or something, I don't know. And let's say I was working on something from another image and I need to turn it gray or something. I can press Control-Shift-U. It turns it gray. You can see what gray looks like compared to that light blue and light orange everywhere. Well, maybe I want to make this light blue. I can go to Image, Adjust, Hue, Saturation, Colorize. Yeah, and I could colorize it. I can make it blue or orange or whatever the case may be. Let's make it orange. Of course, it won't be that saturated. It's going to be very lightly orange. Okay, click OK. Use your blending options. So if you double click on a layer in this little blink area here, brings up your blending layers, or layer styles box. All right, tools. This one right here where it says blend if gray in this layer, you can bump these around a lot and get some really interesting textures out of it. You can also hold Alt left click and you can split them, and it's going to make it blend a little bit nicer. So something like that you might do, and then maybe you just want to add that as color. All right, you can certainly do that, or add some maybe like dirt kind of look to it. Change the opacity down a little. You can see how I have these nice faint colors in there now, and that blue still gets to poke through. And you can do this for light areas or dark areas, and you can kind of mix them together. So you can also do another one of blue and then have it only affect the lighter contrasted areas of the image. So keep that in mind. It's pretty cool to do that, and it works well. It's also good for glass and things that are transparent as well. All right. So for the most part, do everything you can in Photoshop. And what you'll end up with is you'll end up with something like this. Okay. And you just work through it little by little. This should be the longest process of making a weapon. All right. And when you finally get it all said and done, you'll end up with some pretty stellar results. And so I pretty much showed you most of my tips and tricks there. Just one other thing I want to mention, and that is you can kind of fudge things around. Like this right here is only the same image repeated 3 times over and over. Now I won't leave it that way personally, but you can see how it lays out in the actual texture. That's just a side view flipped over, top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom, right? So it's flipped vertically and then flipped vertically and then flipped vertically. But that's just an image. And now I'll go back and I will fix this area to look more appropriate, so that it looks more straight, kind of like I did with the barrel. Okay, sometimes you will have to create kind of your own textures, and so this barrel is one that I've created. And I use my pen for the little edges and stuff. So I can come in here with a really small brush and just add little details to it. So it's not going to be quite as perfect or as smooth, but I can add little shadows where I need them. Just try to get it all to look right. Now, the one thing you want to remember is that the left side and the right side, you want to try to keep them working with each other. So they should be about the same colors. They should be almost perfectly the same on the last pixel there. And you can start varying it as you go out from the edges of your UV maps and your islands. If there's nothing there on the edge of the island, you don't have to worry about it so much. But that's how that works out. Now this one, of course, isn't finished, but I'll keep working on it and doing that. You can see here, so like I was saying earlier, you have to line these up kind of carefully. So don't be afraid to use your transform tools and warp and everything. It's pretty important that you do use those. So for example, if I was to grab something and I wanted to warp it, press Control T. Oop, not Control T, if it'll let me. And no, do I not have it selected or something? No, it's selected. Control T, and it's not letting me. So what is that? Oh, I locked it. That's why. Control T. There we go. So now you can go to something like warp. If you needed it to bend, you can arc it. You can change the direction of the arc. So there's all kinds of fun things you can do. You can add splits to it, so you can control it even finer. All that little details there. Let's go back a little bit. We could do let's exit that. We'll do Control T one more time. We can do another. We can do just a standard warp. We can also split that as well. You can split it in like 2 different areas if needed. So then you can grab this whole bar by holding Shift, and you can just move just that section up or down. That's pretty useful as well. I just wanted to mention that because I find myself using that quite a bit when trying to line things up like these guys. And it's pretty important to get it right. And last but not least, the model itself, I've made some adjustments. This I've made a lot thinner so that it meets up with the rail. I made the top the same way and it meets up with the rail. Now I did this after I UV mapped it. So what it did is it distorted the UV map. You have to go back and manually fix that. And so whenever you do something like that, go back and fix your UV map as you work through it. It's a little bit, you know, sometimes it'll, if you don't go and fix it, what you end up with is problems. So if, like, for example, I wanted to move this guy back or forward, you'll see that it stretches a lot. But if I go back into the UV editor and select that area of the model right here, I can fix that manually, okay, by pushing it forward as well. And so I'll end up with pretty much the same results there, but I have to adjust it. Now your template won't match up, but you can always just resave it and then re-import it into Photoshop. Now, your texture won't line up either, though. So I highly recommend, once you start texturing, do not try to modify your model a whole lot, because you're going to run into a bunch of problems usually. Scaling and squishing the texture in the middle, like if I was to scale inwards a little, you can see that doesn't have a huge effect because it's mostly gray, but you know, other places, like where we're just doing that will really mess you up. You can move things around with sliding though. So if you forgot to optimize something and you want to get rid of an edge, you can grab a vertex or edge or face or whatever, press G twice and move it. Sliding doesn't affect the UV map, so you can always keep knocking off polys as needed. All right. All in all, I think I covered everything I need to in this video. You're going to spend some time on this. This is probably the most mundane and boring part of creating a weapon, in my opinion, but you'll get kind of used to it. And so after this, once you create your weapon and it's textured, it's pretty much almost ready to go in the game. You know, create the other stuff you want to put on it. So create a suppressor. I got to create a sight still, but you're going to get it all put together and finished here first before we do anything else, because we're going to actually scale. And I'll show you how to do this when we start importing the weapon into 3D Studio Max 5. Is right before we import it, we're going to actually scale it so that this is the correct size. If I modeled, for example, I don't know the scale, or I don't know the exact size of the suppressor in real life. I know I made it off of an image reference and I closely guesstimated the actual size compared to the model, but I don't know the actual size. And so when I go to scale this, I'm going to also scale the suppressor at the same time. That way the suppressor should be about correct. All right, but I can't do that if the suppressor is not there. Otherwise, I'd have to scale the suppressor in its own scene and find out the length of it. But I'm not worried about the length for that one because it's specific to the AUG, so it's not a big deal. All right, and that's it for this video. I know it kind of ran on a little bit, but take your time with it. Have fun. Don't worry about it, you know, too much. You know, you take your time on this. I still got to finish it up. I still got a bunch of stuff I can do to it, and you will as well. Now, when it comes to like applying camouflage and stuff, I'm going to make a tutorial all about that, because it's really hard with the seams we have to get things to match up left or right like that. But camouflage we can actually put on here somewhat easily, and it just requires a little bit more thought process on how you're going to do it, and it's kind of its own thing. It's a little bit complicated. So nonetheless, thanks for watching.